The first speaker is Dr Harvey McMahon. He is a senior scientist at the Laboratory of Molecular Biology here in Cambridge. He trained as a neurobiologist and has worked on looking at brain function, how the brain works for the past decade or so. And he is author of numerous papers. He's also a fellow of the Royal Society. We're very glad to have you here, Harvey, and look forward to what you've got to say.
Right. So I've got the big task of the unanswerable question, what is free will? Now, there are many layers of explanation of free will, and I come as a neurobiologist, so I'm going to tell you the cognitive aspects and the brain side, brain mechanistic function side of free will. So you may try to answer some of these questions, and of course I'm limiting free will because of my view of it, and I'm going to give you my view. My view is that it is a high cognitive function, and therefore we can't ascribe it to things like bacteria. You could say bacteria can act in random ways, but in some ways we're getting into some sort of psychology or some sort of unknowns we can't really explain because we can't actually test these things. So with the human, we can actually know that we have free will. I don't believe that free will is an illusion. We heard about illusions in the previous talk. In the sense that we can actually iterate types of free will by stimulating different pathways in the brain. We certainly know that it's seated in the brain and we can manipulate it in the brain. And in that sense, for us, it's a physical, there's a physical explanation of it, although we may not have the complete explanation. Now, it's absolutely essential for humanity that we have the feeling of free will. It's essential for our feeling of well-being, and as a result, we all want to hold on to this incredibly tightly. Now, in the past, it wasn't always seated in the brain. We refer to it all in the brain. It's in a mechanism, and at some level, the mind is the working of those mechanisms. Right, so that's where the Egyptians come into it. Now, I asked my son for a definition. So he's 12 years old, so he said freedom is to do whatever I want all day long. I play computer games or just do. And some level, I can see that that's a reasonable explanation for a child, but of course we want something slightly better. So here I put up what I would feel is a reasonable explanation is ability to do something that's non-obvious. So it's not the addition of 2 + 2 = 4. You may feel that you're from freedom in making that sum, that answer to that sum, but in some ways it's defined. It's a reflex arc. It's already defined. And there are many scenarios that you may feel you have freedom, but you're actually constrained by those reflex arcs that are within the brain. So you could make the decision that it's going to be 5. That would be free will. You've made that decision to do it in some ways. It's a bit too simplistic. So freedom to exercise will within predetermined limits. So these limits are very important to define, and how the brain defines those limits is very important to figure out how that works. Now, the first thing I would say is that free will is not on the opposite side of the spectrum to determinism. It's really not on the opposite side. So it's not the opposite. So we can have non-deterministic and deterministic events. So you can think about the atom, the non-determinism within an atom, but that doesn't say that the atom has free will. So we think of the description of salt in the salt shaker. Salt doesn't have in any sense free will. My foot doesn't have in any sense free will. So in that sense, I am attributing free will to cognitive function. Okay, and then even despite the fact that non-determinism seems to be an underlying principle that needs to underwrite free will, still free will has determinism because it needs to be within determined limits. So it has to have both of those aspects. So that's why it's not on the opposite side, and you could take that theologically. It's not the opposite to predetermination, etc., whatever else you might want to think there. Now, we may limit it by some of the following. We may say that our genes can limit our freedom. Your brain limits your freedom, your cognitive abilities. Your hormones limit what you might consider or some of the things you might want to do or cause you to do other things. My friends and environment are changing your free will as well, and your iPhone or something like that. There's many other things you can say about it. So here I'm trying to pull the limits in of the definition. So free will is the ability to choose within predetermined limits. Okay. Now, I want to get to why I believe it's a cognitive function, why I believe it's centered in the brain, and what's so special about the brain. I have 3 points for this. The first of those, I can't actually read my own slides up there. It's a bit of a blur. The first of those I've stated here as stability of neurons. Now, the very fact is that if I take an individual neuron in the person's brain in the front seat here and map it into the brain of the person in the back seat, it'll likely have the same place, the same position, the same architecture. So in other words, the architectures of our brains are quite highly orchestrated from birth. They're really there. The mapping of that is not so different from one person to another. Now, of course, we don't know that for the human brain because it's so complex. But we do know that for all the organisms below us, or for many of the organisms below us. So I take an example here of a neuron from a fly brain. This is a neuron from a fly brain, and it's mapped onto many, many other neurons. It's the way in which we look at the brain maps of these organisms. And in doing that, we have actually found some interesting things, and that is that there are just a handful of neurons that turn out to be different. And you can ascribe to these neurons functions. And so these are sexually dimorphic neurons. The purple here versus the green is a male versus a female fly, and every male will have this sort of architecture, and every female will have the other architecture. So really imprinted in the circuitry is some sort of mechanical difference, we might want to say, but it's very small. It's incredibly small. Now, we need this sort of architecture of the brain, and we also need the constancy of the brain, that it's not constantly turning over its neurons in order to have free will. Because when we have neurons that don't turn over, we encode memories within them, and therefore we have those memories from birth to death. Well, at some level they get more hazy maybe, or we get new ones, but at some level we are keeping a constant record. And that's what's very special about your brain. The cells don't turn over at any sort of level that any other cell in your body can turn over. You fluff everything else off, but the brain you keep. So of course, the underlying memories, you have to have memories in order to have choices. Memories are what actually lead you to be able to make those choices. So that's the first of the architecture of the brain. The second thing is the integration power of the brain. Now here is that same fly brain that I mentioned a few minutes ago. It's got about 100,000 neurons. And to scale, here is the mouse brain with 100 million neurons. And to scale is the human brain with 100 billion neurons. Now you think of massive numbers, therefore you think of massive integration potential. But actually it really is integration potential because it's not a distributed nervous system. It's all bundled up in one tight nodule, and that's what we call a brain. Any organism that has a bundle of nerves tightly knotted up, we would call that a brain. And the reason is, when you bundle them right up together, they all cross-talk to each other. So one neuron at one side of the spectrum, by a few nodes, will talk to the other neuron at absolutely the other side of it. You think these things have absolutely nothing to do with each other, and yet they're connected. Okay, so that gives you a massive integration potential, and of course that's essential to be able to take in all the stimuli and to process them. So this goes beyond the reflex arc. So this is the reflex, the patellar extension reflex arc, where you basically either have monosynaptic or a few types of interconnections between neurons, and you know what you're going to get back out. 2 plus 2 does equal 4. When you go into the brain with that level of complexity, with that number of synapses, dear knows what you're going to get back out. So you have a lot of integration. Now, the third thing, and probably this is hierarchical, because this is probably the more important aspect of the brain, is its plasticity. Right from birth, your brain is plastic. Right from the moment you're born, you don't know how to talk, you don't know how to walk. Now, there are many animals that do, but you don't. You're very special in the sense that you are plastic from day one. You're putting this model of your environment into your brain. You're putting the model of your environment into your brain. It's not someone else's. You have actually experienced all of this. And that's what's leading you to then have some sort of input later on which you can make decisions. Okay? So plasticity just means that it is moldable. You can change it. And I've got a few examples of it, but it occurs at the level of synapses, not at the level of those neurons that are basically, the architecture is firm. It occurs at the level of where neurons synapse on each other, and this is a picture of a synapse. I work on synapses, as maybe some of you know. And I've starred here some of the synapses, and they're basically the connections between all the wires. And you can change those connections at will. When you do things, and you repetitively do them, you change the connections. When you come across new things, you make another connection. Okay, that's one level at which memories are laid down, but it's one level at which the wiring diagrams are changed all the time. I'll give you one example here, and this is from the visual cortex in a mouse, in a mouse brain. And what has happened here is, this is the time, the days after birth, and what we're looking at is when the eyes of the mouse are going to open. And during the stage that the eyes of the mouse open, it takes a lot of information into its visual cortex, and of course, these little spines here are the synapses that it's making, and it makes, you can see, orders of magnitude more synapses when it's getting the information. So it lays down that information, of course. That's what's leading to plasticity at the level of the synapse and plasticity at the level of circuits, change in the circuits. Now, how do we know the brain is the seat of free will? I'm going to give you the first couple of examples, or you could argue, are simply just what's setting the parameters around free will. So withdrawal from pain reflexes. So normally you would think you have control over that, but the brain actually can tell you, no, I've got control over it because you have a reflex that will stop you controlling it. Yeah? Anesthetic, you might want to think that you could stay awake all the time. We know that we can't at some level, but yeah, anesthetics very well show us that that is seated within the brain, and you can actually overcome it by giving someone an anesthetic. Narcotics can go the opposite way. It can give you a feeling of more free will, alcohol, other things like that. Neuroacting drugs, and there are many examples here, but dopamine agonists for Parkinson's is one example of where you give a patient something like propinerol. You have to tell them, look, you may very well have some more extreme behaviors. You may become a little bit more promiscuous, and you may gamble your life's inheritance away, and you can't help it. Because this drug is going to do this to your brain. It's actually overriding the inhibitory functions or the executive functions your brain would normally have to stop you doing those things, and away you go. So that's just some examples along the way of where the brain is probably changing the limits on what we would define as the free will. But there are more direct experiments that investigate this, where you go in with electrodes and you can actually change the behavior of the mouse, or you can change the behavior of the human, but these experiments will be done more in mice, I have to say, because it's probably more possible to do, isn't it? And you can change the patterns of what they can do, the choices that they can make. Limited, I have to say, for mice, but very, very clear examples of where you can push something one direction or another. So that's more direct evidence. Now, coming back to this spectrum, that free will is a spectrum between compulsion, where you would say you have virtually no free will whatsoever, or else the ability to make the non-obvious choices. That spectrum is surrounded by the laws of physics, the laws of biology, the laws of your social circumstances. You cannot stand up in the room right now, although you may feel that you have the freedom to do, and wave your arms around because you'll hit the person right next to you. So there's some sorts of rules that actually govern your free will at that level. So free will isn't a point on this sign, but it's a zone. It's a zone, and different people have different restrictions on it, and so therefore will be positioned at different levels. Now, how does it work? So free will is based, to some extent, on the past. I've already mentioned this, but basically, your choices are based on your memories. So if you want to get the molecular correlates, you have to go down these sorts of lines and see how the memories are actually giving rise to the possibilities of the predictions that you can make. So at the end of the day, the past has to be recorded, the memories have to be analysed, and at that level you're making some sort of basis on which to make the decisions. You also have to have the ability, as we heard in the last talk, to make these future predictions, hallucinations, whatever else you might want to say that might be somewhere in here. You have to be able to imagine. Imagine what the consequence of the conversation with your neighbour might happen to be, and think through the circumstances on when you might have that conversation. But more importantly, the present. We have so many cues coming in from the present that if I took you now and put you in the pub, you would be thinking something quite different from what you were thinking right now. So the present is really what's governing what is the thoughts and choices that we have. And I want to take you away from the adult brain and put you back into the young, the baby's brain. Because at the baby's brain, you don't have these predictive powers, you don't have the memories, and therefore does the baby have free will? Well, of course it has free will, because it's free will of a different sort. It's free will where it's actually determining what are the parameters for later on going to be. So it has to actually figure out what the environment is actually like. And so some way it is exploring that environment, but laying that down then, in some way, as an instinctive pathway. So it lays down all of those things like walking and talking as instinctive, and later on, then they'll have choices about different things because those pathways are very difficult to modify. You could modify your gait later on in life if you wanted to, if you worked hard enough at it, because your brain is plastic, but you'd have to work mighty hard at it. You can modify any of your behaviours, but you have to work hard at it. So instinct is different from free will. At that point, it's been laid down more into the surface. I already mentioned to you the baby's brain is one of those amazing things. It's just so plastic that you'd almost think you could make it into whatever you wanted to. But it's designed that way. That's why it is, because we have this feature of freedom to make the choices with it. Now, I sort of have constrained free will to the brain, but somehow or other I can't give you a proper explanation of it. I can give molecular correlates of what it might be, and I haven't bothered you with those. But at some level, I've said to you that it's much more to do with the present. It's much more to do with something else. So the things around you are influencing what those parameters are. And in fact, we live in this very strange world, which is called the world of relationships. So you're not so much constrained by your genetics and the fact you've got some disease, because within that parameter you have perfect possibilities to make lots of decisions and be free. Even if you're put within a prison, you're perfectly free. Your freedom hasn't actually been taken away. You're actually constrained more by the relationships that you have in the world and how your brain responds to those relationships than to the genetics. One other way to say this is that you are not an island. If you were an island, you could do whatever you want on that island, get up in the middle of the day, eat all you wanted, be sick all you wanted, do whatever you want, but the very fact you live in the world, I have to look after my family in the morning, get some money to buy the food, and I have to, constrain by all the relationships that I have in life in order, so my free will actually is more defined by the relationships that I have. Now, I would ask the question, what is the most important relationship that you have? Is that your family? Is that your workplace? Is that your God? Now, you could very clearly say that the most important relationship, at least for people who believe in God, is that relationship with God, because they carry it around from one end of the day to the other. They don't carry their family around from one end of the day to the other, but you carry your relationship with God. And so in that sense, your relationship with God can be tremendously influential on your free will, on your decisions that you actually make. And in such a way, you're communicating with God, or He's communicating with you. I just put this up just transiently because, of course, in Western society, we believe that we all have this exaggerated view of our own freedom without consideration for the freedom of others around us. And I've been positioning this to say, actually, yes, it may be centered in the brain, but it's largely in the community, in the relationships you're having outside of the brain. So, in this brief talk, I've suggested the following. Very brief. I haven't told you anything about how the brain works, really. Free will relies on a complex nervous system centered in the brain that can integrate inputs from many different sources. Free will is constrained by the laws of physics, constrained by many things, established neuronal pathways, memories of what's been laid down since childhood, and the environment. Not exhaustive either, that list. Free will is choices that are made at the level of the integrated neural circuits that interact bidirectionally. So this is this bidirectional interaction between where the environment influences you, your friends influence you, you influence the environment. And that's, to a large extent, where it's occurring with the social network of relationships and the quality of each relationship. So if the quality of your relationship with God is very strong, of course God will have a tremendously influencing power over you. But if the quality of your relationship with work is the strongest, that will be the thing that influences your freedoms and choices within the network and relational proximity, etc. The Bible shows us the most important relationship which ultimately drives the behavior of both social and neural networks to be the quality of our relationship with God. I mentioned that as well. Amazing I actually said it. It is partly the past history of Eden that constrains our freedom. Now this is an interesting sort of thought, that basically your brain is controlled by the sin of the past. Somehow or other it gets encoded into the networks because your parents are telling you what to do and how to act selfishly, how to act all those sort of things. We are teaching our kids really the sin of Adam by passing it along from one generation to another. We are constraining the freedom, but it's also the present relationship that we have with God that liberates us from the systems of selfishness and selfish behaviours and priorities, and opens up the world of new possibilities. So there's lots of things that one can say about this. So of course, our relationship with God does lead to a freedom because we aren't controlled by the thoughts and moral behaviours of those around us and trying to constantly. I am on my summaries. Summary. We aren't constrained by the constant shifting morality of society. We're constrained by what God has set out for us. So in some ways, yes, it is a freedom, but it's a freedom at many different levels because we aren't constrained by laws. We are constrained by a loving forgiveness that God can offer to us, and we're constrained by lots of different things. And we know that God knows the frailty of our judgments and actions and doesn't actually hold that against us. So, as I said, for humans, the very perception of free will is empowering and essential for well-being. This has been crafted in a social setting because of the freedom that I have to interact with many people, probably not you, but I would love if you actually tuned what I have thought and email me and tell me about it. But it's been crafted within my family, my lab members who've been very influential in what I think. I can't help it. That's the environment in which I'm growing up and changing my neuronal collections. My friends, Dr. Mike Schluter and Brendan Bromwich, have talked to me over the last few weeks about this to make sure that I actually did prepare the talk, and this time a little bit in advance. If you know the last talk I gave I prepared it the night before. And much of the artwork is from an initiative I run for communication of science in the community. Thank you.